This video is looking at the integrity of different marking and evaluation processes. The key element underpinning integrity of marking processes is reducing subjectivity and variability in the marking activities themselves. The key question is, can you genuinely say that you could mark and grade the same piece of work twice at two different points and give it the same mark each time? Key ideas underpinning this are investigations into working memory limitations. Going back to the 1950s and Miller's magical number of 7 plus or minus 2 paper, it's been suggested that our working memory can conceptualize between 5 and 14 different categories reliably at any one time. Obviously there's individual differences in working memory capacity, and so that ability varies between individuals, but it's generally agreed that about 14 is the maximum number of different concepts you can hold in your working memory at any one given time. So that impacts on how we regulate and how we design the marking approaches that we use in our assessments. And effectively, how blunt do we need to be in order to be reliable, but also in order to have differentiation between different levels of learners, if that's important. And there are various different ways of doing that. A lot of people mark to individual percentage points or to boundaries within those individual percentage points, a process known as categorical marking. Or they mark to letter grades, for example A minus, B plus, B, B minus, and so on. Or in some cases where there are clarified regions of degree boundaries, for example in the UK, first class, upper second class, lower second class, third class honours, they might mark to those boundaries. And in some cases it's a binary thing or a near binary, so it's either pass or fail, or competent or not competent, or safe or unsafe, or it could be fail, pass, merit, distinction, for example. So how blunt do we need to be? There's some sort of comfort in the idea of being able to mark to individual percentages. You then have quite a wide range of percentages to use. But work going back even to the 1930s with Hartog and Rode evaluating marker reliability identified that the idea that you can reliably mark to individual percentage points is a fallacy. You can't mark that accurately. So there's nearly 100 years worth of evidence against that idea. But having a clear idea of what a particular boundary is, what a particular threshold of competence is that a student needs to achieve, is a clear thing to try and develop and a clear thing to try and identify and agree on. So are there core thresholds of competence that are required for the student, and potentially different levels of competence from basic competence to mastery and some sort of degree within those? So grades and pass-fail type approaches are often used in this academic approach of trying to identify a particular threshold, a particular competence, but those tend to be quite blunt. They tend to be quite a relatively small number of individual points within that range. If you need a much wider range, then use of categorical marking is preferable to individual percentage points. So that could be either, for example, a 2, 5 and 8 point in each 10% boundary. So that would be 52, 55, 58, 62, 65, 68 and so on. Or having a 0 point in there as well, so that you've got a very distinct boundary point between the 50s, the 60s, the 70s and so on. Or just having a boundary and a midpoint in each of those 10% ranges. Those are just ways of reducing the number of different categories that you have within a 100% range, but the challenge then is how few categories can you get away with in order to have the right compensation point between being reliable in your marking but having enough variation to show differences between clearly different individuals. You could, for example, go for a 20-point scale, and this is an example of how you can convert a 20-point scale to a 100-point scale or a letter-based scale. So, as we say, probably about 14 or so different categories are about as much as you can reliably include in your marking, but if you excluded the very, very top and the very, very bottom of a 20-point scale as being quite exceptional ideas, then that's not far off that 14 point. That leads to a key issue with having too many different levels within an assessment range or a marking criterion range, is we tend to not use the lower and the upper end of that range. This is particularly true in 100% or individual percentage ranges, where you tend not to have the 80 or above marks or the 20 or below marks allocated, especially in subjective assessments such as essays, reports, dissertations, and so on. And often you see a comment written by an examiner or an assessor saying, excellent work, perfect answer, 75%. It's therefore not clear what that person needs to do in order to achieve those extra 25% of their marks. If it's an excellent work and a perfect answer, surely it should be near to 100%. So marks and grades must be aligned to predefined marking criteria, and to address those criteria directly, you should be able to defend the mark given on a particular piece of work, and you should be able to explain what the student needs to do to gain a higher mark and to potentially reach that 100% perfect answer that you might expect. Now, the key thing is the students need to be aware of those criteria and understand those criteria and to internalise those standards. One of the problems with marking criteria, and here's an example of some potential marking criteria, is that different assessors and different students will have different ideas as to what's important and what's less important. So these marking criteria here, each of the 10% ranges, and they're using a categorical marking system here, has 3 elements within it: the coverage, the accuracy and the depth, and the organisation. Now, Assessor 1 might view accuracy and coverage as the more important element. Assessor 2 might be looking more at depth and the use of extra reading and extra ideas. And Assessor 3 might be focusing more on the logic and the structure of the assignment. Each of those are equal factors and will be important towards the overall holistic mark, but each of them will be applying different levels of importance to those, and so they'll be marking the same piece of work but will come out with different grades as a result. So those marking criteria are very useful, and you can have marking criteria that cover a range of different elements, providing you identify what the different characterizations of the subdivisions of those criteria are. But it often helps to be able to identify pre-assigned percentages to some of those criteria. And here again is another example. So we're looking at various different criteria here. The idea with this is that you would select some of those criteria and form a rubric based on 2 or 3 of the criteria rather than all of them. And more importantly, you provide a percentage weighting for those criteria, those individual sub-criteria, so that then when you allocate a mark based on the rubric to that particular sub-criterion, then it's already been predetermined the importance that has within the overall mark that you produce at the end. An approach like this, even though it's using categorical marking in each of those columns, will provide a final mark that's an individual percentage, or could even be a decimal of an individual percentage, but it's based on a small number of agreed weighted criteria marked in a blunt categorical marking type of an approach. It's therefore much likely to be reproducible and reliable, and for 2 different assessors to mark the same piece of work and come up with a mark that's very similar to each other. A very important concept is that 100% does not equate to the perfect answer that could ever be written. 100% is the best possible answer that a particular student, for example a first or second or third year or fourth year undergraduate, with that level of experience and their time and resources available to them, that's the best thing that they could realistically write in that setting. So for example, it could be if it's an undergraduate, 18 to 21 or 22-year-old student with only a few years of experience in that subject, writing potentially under a time pressure. Potentially if it's a closed exam, they're writing from memory. If it is an exam, they might be in stressful conditions, they might be suffering from an anxiety as a result of that, and you're examining something which is a tiny fraction of the things that they're having to learn for an exam or for an assessment. And so 100% is the best answer that you could realistically expect that student in those conditions with that experience and those underlying backgrounds to achieve within the context of that assessment. not the perfect answer that could be written by a Nobel laureate in that subject. So the key things to think of when designing assessments and reviewing those assessments so that they're fit for purpose is that assessment fair? Is it the marking process going to be fair and reproducible? Do all assessors have the same perception of the marking criteria? Do they share that assessment and understanding of the marking criteria with the students? And is it clear when you provided a mark for the student where that mark came from and what the student would need to do in order to achieve a higher mark or a higher grade in that area?